What do you do if you're a man who has a wife and 2 kids and you can't provide for them? When someone says to you, just trust the Lord, that doesn't sound very helpful, does it? It sounds quite trite and trivial. What does trusting the Lord have to do when you've got a bill to pay and the bank account is empty? What do you do when the housing market is soaring and you can't afford to get in, let alone pay your next month's rent? What do you do when global turmoil disturbs food supplies and suddenly you find yourself going from paycheck to paycheck, whether it's bills and housing and credit card debt that's accumulating? How does trusting God relate to your problems? If 2020 and 2021 have taught us anything, it's that in a globalized world where we saw enormous amounts of people, about 1 billion people, lifted out of poverty because of the nature of globalization. If globalization was caring for people and helping the poorest of the poor become better off, what COVID has done is it has absolutely decimated the many ways that people who are at the bottom of the scale have been able to survive. It's caused the have-nots to have less. And so the haves of the world have access to vaccines and in great supply. The haves of the world have been able to easily pivot, and they love that word pivot because it's a word that only the haves can use, because the haves can work from home. The people who have can function like there's nothing wrong, that life carries on. There's been some disruption, but for the have-nots, they don't have the health care. We see that in India today. The have-nots, they don't have access to vaccines. The Western nations have massively purchased those items, and it's meant that poorer countries are struggling to get vaccines into the arms of their citizens. It's meant that people who don't have access to reliable internet can't just pivot and work from home. They have to go to work. They have to expose themselves to other people who are sick. They don't have sick days. Their employer doesn't give them sick days. If they get sick, they've got to go to work, because if they don't go to work, their family doesn't eat. And this is what our world is like. Globalization has given way to nationalism. And while there were certain problems with globalism, certainly the benefits that it brought about for many of the poorest of the poor were enormous and good. And so when we think about trusting God, it's a very practical thing. Because to ask someone to trust God when they're going without, when they can't pay the bills, when they don't have the ability to put bread on their table, when they are struggling, when they've got to leave their house because of foreclosure, trusting God is no small thing. And it dare not be an impractical thing. The book of Ruth is actually about these exact issues. Not merely about trusting God, but how God is actually working in our world in the midst of hardship and turmoil and pain and suffering to bring about His redemption. And He brings about His redemption in a way that is not impractical, but enormously practical. And as we learn what it means to trust God for His redemptive work, the book of Ruth will help us to see how God is working in our world to restore and renew and make something beautiful out of something that looks horrible. And so I want us to see 3 things this morning, 3 things about how God is working to bring about His redemption. And what does redemption look like? The first thing I want us to see comes from chapter 1. And it's really a call to return to the Lord. In chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, we get the setting of the story. Elimelech is a man who he can't feed his wife and 2 kids. He's from Bethlehem. Bethlehem means the house of bread, and there's no bread in the house of bread. There's no barley in the fields. He hears that things might be better in Moab, and so he's willing to go to Moab. These are in the days of the judges, we're told. These days where everyone does what is right in his own eyes because there was no king in Israel. And so Elimelech, whose name means God is my king, does what is right in his own eyes because there is no king in Israel, and he cannot trust the Lord to provide. So he abandons his home in Bethlehem, the house of bread, to go to Moab. And he goes to Moab, which is anything but a place that an Israelite would have felt comfortable in. Moab, they were the result of Lot. Lot had had an incestuous relationship, and out of that incestuous relationship had given birth to a child who was the father of the Moabites. And the Moabites had been a thorn in Israel's side ever since that first day. We're told, in fact, in Numbers chapter 25, they were idol worshipers. In Deuteronomy 23, we are told that the Moabites had tried to purchase Balak to pronounce a curse upon Israel. That they were the ones in Judges 3 who were oppressing Israel. These were no friends of the Israelites. And yet Elimelech goes to Moab. And he takes his wife, Naomi, whose name means pleasant, and he goes with her and leaves the pleasantness of what was Bethlehem to go find something else. And he takes his two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. In other words, their names are Mr. Weakling and Mr. Wearing Out. That's what their names mean. And so he takes Mr. Wearing Out and Mr. Weakling along with his pleasant wife, and my God is my king, goes to Moab, abandoning and leaving all that he has known. He's leaving God behind. God hasn't provided in the way that he wanted, in the way that he thought. And so he does what is right in his own eyes. And as he goes to Moab, what he finds is that Moab is really no better. Elimelech dies, we're told, and sometime later, 10 years later, his sons, Mr. Weakling and Mr. Wearing Out, die themselves. They've married Moabite women, which indicates that they did not follow in the ways of God. That they've married foreign women and foreign wives, and so they're not following the Lord. And as a result of that, they leave Naomi as a widow, along with Ruth and Orpah. Naomi, though, is anything but pleasant. She's not living up to her name. In chapter 1, in fact, we're told that as Naomi sees all these things that goes on, she says, "Don't call me Naomi, but call me Mara. My name means bitterness, because the Lord has been against me," she says. Twice she says that in chapter 1, verse 13, and chapter 1, verse 20. The Lord's hand has been against me. He's against me. And in feeling this, she has become bitter. And so she hears word that the house of bread, Bethlehem, has bread again. And so she decides it's time for her to go back. And she urges her daughters, "You can come with me or you can go back to your homeland." And this word, to go back, actually becomes the key word in chapter 1. It's used repeatedly, over and over and over. Go back. Go back to your own country, girls. Go back. I can't give you a husband. I can't provide for you. I can't care for you, Orpah and Ruth. And so Orpah, she goes back. But Ruth is different. She knows that her mother-in-law can't care for her, but she won't go back to Moab. She makes this beautiful confession in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. "Do you not urge me to leave you or to return from following you? For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And here is a loyal and devoted woman. She won't go back. She won't go back to her home country of Moab. She won't go back to the foreign gods. She won't go back and find another man. She'll stick with her mother-in-law. Now, Naomi may have returned back, going back to Bethlehem for very mixed motives. She's like the prodigal son almost in the Gospel of Luke, who sees how terrible things are, comes to his senses and goes back. And Naomi has felt the utter devastation, and she goes back to Bethlehem because, well, practically, there's bread in Bethlehem, and she's hungry, and life has been hard. And she goes back, and Ruth is a devoted woman who now becomes, well, she has been a widow, and she becomes functionally an orphan by giving up her homeland and her people. And she's a sojourner, and she's a stranger in a foreign land among a foreign people. But the amazing thing is that God had commanded his people to look after the widow and the orphan and the sojourner and the stranger. And this is precisely what the Lord will do. He calls his people to speak and show redemption, and by speaking and showing redemption, it is to display that when you return to the Lord, that there is grace and kindness that abounds. And so chapter 1 is really a call to return to the Lord, and in all of our mixed motives, in all of our distorted understandings of why we should go back to God. We often go back to God because, well, life has been hard, and, well, I guess it can't be much worse if I return to him. God welcomes those who return to him. And so the call of chapter 1 of Ruth is really go back. Don't just go back to the house of bread. Go back to the Lord, even if his hand has dealt you a bitter and hard providence, even if life has been so painful and difficult. But not only is redemption about returning to the Lord, redemption is about seeking and finding the kindness of the Lord. This is what chapters 2 and 3 are really all about. There's two really parallel narratives. The story's building, but there's this parallel between these two chapters. Ruth and Naomi having a conversation, hatching a plan, working it out. Boaz and his interactions, and finally then this act of redemption. Both chapters 2 and chapters 3 have all of these elements being worked out within them. And in it, what we find is that in the house of bread, there is bread again, and there is a noble man, a man named Boaz. Boaz is a relative, we don't know how close, but he's a relative of Elimelech. And he is known for being such a noble man that the young women who are local, they like to work in his field and pick up the extra pieces of the barley that's fallen by the wayside that the harvesters have maybe missed. They don't gather from just the edges of the field, but they're well supplied. Boaz is a man who takes care of the widow and the orphan and the sojourner and the stranger. Apparently, women were not treated well in the book of Judges, and we can get that sense because Boaz even tells his men to watch out and protect these women, and he instructs his workers to care for their needs. And so Ruth and Naomi, they're looking for favor. Or another word that we could use to describe what that is they're looking for grace. They know that they don't deserve all of this kindness. And so it's no mere chance that Ruth ends up in Boaz's field. Though in verse 3 of chapter 2, we're told that Ruth just happened to be in this field. Ruth is a noble woman. She's abandoned her gods and left behind her people, and she's sticking with her mother-in-law no matter what. And yet, it just so happens that in God's good design and in God's good providence, that she's in Boaz's field. As she interacts with Boaz, Boaz is a noble man who says to her, "May the Lord cover you with his wing." Chapter 2, verse 12. May he put his wing of protection over you. May he protect you and keep you and care for you and nurture you. And as he says this, Boaz goes about doing what was required of the law and exceeding it. The law had said that when you were harvesting in the field, that you weren't to cut right to the edges of the field, that you were to leave the edges of the field so that the sojourner and the stranger and the widow and the orphan, that they could go and take the food and glean, if you would, from the edges of the field so that those who were poor could have something to eat. This was, in this time, a way of practicing social care. It was the social safety net. It was the way that you did charity. It's how you gave to the poor and needy. You didn't harvest absolutely everything of your field. You left a little bit so that those who had nothing could survive. It was what the law had instructed. But Boaz does more than just leave the edges of his field. He instructs his men to see the women who are there, especially this noble woman, Ruth. He's heard all about her. When Naomi had come back, there was all sorts of talk about her. And Ruth, this Moabite woman, this foreigner, this stranger, well, she must be quite something to leave behind her gods and her people. And so, like the Lord, who cares for the widow and the orphan and the sojourner and the stranger, so Boaz, he cares for someone who is of an enemy people of his own. These Moabites, the people who've oppressed his people, the people who've wanted curses upon Israel. So when Naomi gets word from Ruth that she's been in Boaz's field and all of the kindness that she's experienced, they hatch a plan. And they hatch this enormous plan, and we need to know a couple of details here to help us understand some of the broader movements of the Old Testament law. In Leviticus 25:25, we're told that if you had a family member who could purchase your land, if you had fallen into debt, you couldn't care for your land, you had to sell it, that you could have a family member who could purchase it and redeem it for you. That way it would be kept in the family name, and on the year of Jubilee, it would be returned to you. Now, after 10 years, there's no doubt that this farmland would be anything but good farmland. It'd need to be worked pretty well. There'd be a lot of work to care for any farm that's been neglected for 10 years. And so, in Leviticus 25:25, this offer is made. And Naomi knows that Boaz is a family member who could purchase this land. But not only is Boaz someone who could purchase the land, but in Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 to 10, there was also a provision for widows. That if a woman died who had no children, there was this vow that could be made by someone to redeem them, the family redeemer or kinsman redeemer. A kinsman redeemer then would take their close relative, typically if there was a woman of the family who had no children, and children were your social security safety net, they were your unemployment insurance and your retirement plan in the ancient world. If you didn't have any of those, you were really left destitute. And the law provided a way for you to have, well, a social security safety net. It was called this act of family redemption. What a person could do is a man could marry a woman, a widow from his own house, his own family, his extended family, typically a brother who had a wife who had not had any children. And he could marry her, provide for her, give her children, which would allow her then the safety and security in a world where women were incredibly disadvantaged. This made the Old Testament law radically different than the nations around them. The Old Testament law was incredibly pro-woman. It was incredibly mindful of the goodness that women needed as image bearers of God, as people fully needing the glory of God to be on display. In a world that neglected women and used women, it lifted up women and it acknowledged their goodness. And so in this Old Testament law, which was so good, Ruth and Naomi hatch a plan. Boaz is working night and day. In the daytime, he's out in the fields. He's getting as much of the harvest in. It's long hours, like our farmers well know. But at night, he's spending a lot of time at the threshing floor. He's making sure that the production is carrying on. You've got to deal with the product as it's coming in. Now, on a night where they're a little bit more joyful and celebratory, you know that time of harvest where it's just, this is a good time. Ruth is instructed by Naomi, go, watch where Boaz sleeps. And as he goes to sleep, go lie by his feet. Don't do anything unbecoming, but be noble and be dignified. And as she goes around midnight and she lies at Boaz's feet, he stirs around midnight, notices that his foot has bumped something and it's a little awkward. And he wakes up and, who are you? To which Ruth replies in chapter 3, verse 9, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. Now, Boaz had said to Ruth in chapter 2, verse 12, may the Lord cover you with his wings. But now Ruth is saying, put the edge of your garment or the edge of your wing over me. This is something quite radical. It's a marriage proposal, but it's not coming from the man to the woman. It's coming from the woman to the man. She's essentially saying, Boaz, you're my family redeemer. Would you marry me? She's there ready for him to say yes. And in fact, that's exactly what he does. He's seen that there has been an abounding loving kindness from Ruth, and he will show her favor and loving kindness as well. But there's a little problem that has to be dealt with. And that is the problem that there's a family member who's closer than he is who could perform the act of redemption. Which means that the way that redemption works is not just returning to the Lord and seeking and finding the kindness and favor of God and his good provisions and his good laws. But it also means that we also need to be redeemed and be redeeming people. And that's the third thing I want us to see from chapter 4. Boaz goes to this closer relative and he says to this unnamed man, listen, Elimelech's property is available. Do you want to buy it? Yeah, it's a great piece of land. I'll take it. Well, then there's some obligations that come with the benefits. Yeah, you could really get a lot of harvest from this land. It's really good quality land, but there are 2 widows that you have to take care of. And when the man considers this, and as he thinks about it at the business district of town, he says, no, this would not be good for me. I can't do this. And Boaz, being the faithful man that he is, he carries out his word to Ruth, that he'll redeem the land and he'll redeem both Naomi and Ruth if this other man refuses. And when he refuses and he gives him his sandal as a business sign, that's the contract of the day. I give you my sandal. That's a guarantee that when people have questions about whether or not this was a legitimate business deal, you can just lift my sandal and say, yeah, he gave me a sandal. All is good. Well, as they do that, Boaz pays the price for the land, and he welcomes and receives a foreigner, a widow, an orphan, and a stranger. And he doesn't just welcome her. He loves her. He shows her kindness. He shows her grace. And he makes her his own. She becomes his delight. And he marries her. And he marries her, redeeming her. And he marries her in being a redeemer. And all of this is intended to show us the glory of Christ. Boaz is a family redeemer. He'll pay the price for the land. He'll care for the widow and the orphan and the sojourner and the stranger. He'll show them favor. But the story begins and ends with a very interesting piece. Elimelech, we're told at the beginning, whose name means my God is my king, doesn't act as though God is his king. He does what is right in his own eyes. But Boaz doesn't do what's right in his eyes. Boaz does what is right in the eyes of the Lord. He follows the law, and he not only follows it, he exceeds the requirements of the law. And in exceeding the requirements of the law, in providing an abundance for Ruth and Naomi, in purchasing their land when there was another closer family member who could have done it, when he could have been the one who got out of this arrangement, Boaz does what goes beyond what's required of the law. And as he does that, he gives Ruth a child. That child's name is Obed. And Obed fathers Jesse. And Jesse, we know him as the father of King David. The story begins in Book of Ruth with a man who says, whose name means my God is my king, but doesn't act like it. But it ends with the promise that there is a king coming, a king who is a redeemer, a king born in the house of Bethlehem, the city of David. And some 1,000, 1,200, 1,500, 12, 1,300 years later, another son of David would be born in the house of bread, in the house of Bethlehem. And his name is Jesus. He was a noble man, a man who did everything that the law required, exceeding its requirements, going beyond everything that God had demanded in the law, pursuing justice, caring for the orphan and the widow, giving the blind sight and making the lame walk. He was a man who was bent upon fulfilling the law. And we are told in 1 Peter chapter 1 that what he does is a beautiful work. That when he comes to do a work, we're told in chapter 1, verse 18 of 1 Peter, that you were ransomed, or you were redeemed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ. Because what Christ does as a redeemer is he pays the price for your sins and mine. He purchases us when sin and death required our own blood, and when it required our death, he gave up his life so that we could have ours, that we could find our life in his. And what looked like bitter suffering for Naomi, what looked like her name would mean Mara, was actually a hidden providence. That it wasn't just by happenstance that Ruth ended up in the fields of Boaz. That it was the work of God. A work of God so that Ruth and Boaz would have Obed, who would have Jesse, who would have David, who would be the line, we are told in Matthew 1, from which the great Redeemer would come, Jesus Christ. This is the glory of how Christ's redemption works. Christ's redemption works not only by our proclamation of the gospel, that we have to use words, preach the gospel at all times, if necessary, do good works, but it always requires words. But the redemption that Christ brings is by word and deed. We we have to remember that what God is doing through our good works, by caring for the orphan and the widow and the sojourner and the stranger, by caring for the people who are perceived to be our enemies, that what we are doing is we are displaying the truth of the words of the gospel in our actions. Our actions aren't the gospel, but they bear witness to the truth of the gospel, just as Boaz's actions showed favor and grace to Naomi and Ruth, so our actions of kindness and mercy and pursuing justice are the exact same things. They display the goodness of the words of the news of the gospel. They show and bear witness that Jesus gave up his life as we give up ours. That as we sacrifice for the good of others who are our enemies, what the world sees is that there is something profound in the message of Jesus Christ. But beyond this, Paul can say, we no longer regard anyone according to the flesh. This is what Boaz does. He doesn't look at Naomi as a woman, nor as a Moabite. He looks at her as an image bearer of God, knowing that it's not about your ethnicity or your gender or your social or economic status that matters. It's that every person deserves to be treated in the image of God. And in our world, which wants to always identify in intersectionality and critical race theory and critical theory to identify the group by which you are coming from so that we can identify you and help deal with your suffering, the gospel says we don't regard people according to the flesh. We regard people as image bearers of God, worthy of dignity and needing the grace of God. And in doing that, we display the grace of God and we cast it out widespread. And as we do that, in word and in deed, what we see is that grace works for those who are in need and displays that trusting God is immensely practical. And it allows us to display his goodness to a world that so desperately needs grace.